Death at Bishop's Keep, Chapter 23. Glendover. I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Hotspur. Why, so can I, or so can any man, but will they come when you call for them? William Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 1, 3. On Sunday afternoon, Kate, as a proposed neophyte, was to be introduced to the Order of the Golden Dawn. She and Aunt Sabrina drove to Colchester, where the Temple of Horus was set to meet at number 7 Keenan Street. As they rode through the warm autumn sunshine, past fields hazy with the smoke of burning stubble, Kate considered whether she should tell Aunt Sabrina that she and Sir Charles had the day before discovered the name of the dead Frenchman. But Aunt Sabrina seemed to be in quite a gay mood, talking animatedly about this and that. Perhaps she was relieved that the matter of the dead man was now behind them. In any event, Kate hated to bring it up again and to disclose her mischief. Aunt Sabrina had terminated the investigation. If she knew that her niece had violated her expressed wish by going detecting with Sir Charles, she likely would be deeply disappointed. Furthermore, Kate told herself, there was nothing concrete to report. That the dead man had given the name of Armand to Mr. Prodger meant very little. It could have been a false name. No, the only real evidence they had turned up was the fingerprint and the blue feather, and the name of a street, Queen Street, which on one hand might have been the murdered man's destination, and on the other might have had nothing at all to do with his death. Kate would not know unless she could go there herself and inquire, and she could not for the life of her think how she might accomplish that. But although the jaunt seemed to have yielded little useful information, Kate could not regret the fact that she had gone. For one thing, Beryl Bardwell had enjoyed the opportunity to exercise her wits. For another, Kate had enjoyed the hours she spent with Sir Charles observing his methods of patient and painstaking analysis. She had not thought that so much was to be learned from a single wheel. As Sir Charles drove her back to the Marston carriage, waiting at the railway station, Kate had renewed her request to see the photographs of the dead man, somewhat diffidently, since her aunt had instructed her not to pursue the matter. To that request she added that she would like to see the photographs of the wheel print that he had taken at the site. In reply to his surprised "why?" she had replied evasively, "I hope it is not too much trouble." She could not tell him that Beryl Bardwell was toying with the idea of using a broken wheel as a clue to the solution of a murder. Number 7 Keenan Street was a 3-story brick house with a modest frontage on the street. The parlour and dining room directly behind it were quite crowded. Kate saw, and she thought as she was introduced to her hostess, that the gathering looked more like an afternoon soirée than the meeting of magicians. Beryl Bardwell, who viewed the afternoon as time for research, was making mental notes. "Miss Artley, my dear," Mrs. Farnsworth extended her hand with a warm smile. "It is kind of your aunt to bring you. She says you are making wonderful progress in your research." "Research?" Kate asked. She was momentarily startled before she realized that Mrs. Farnsworth was referring to her secretarial work, not Beryl Bardwell's covert inquiry, of which Mrs. Farnsworth herself was the current object. "Oh yes, the membership lists." "Indeed," Mrs. Farnsworth replied. "The order is growing so fast that it is well nigh impossible to keep account of its membership." She smiled easily at Aunt Sabrina. "When you leave, my dear Sabrina, be sure to take with you the packet of letters and other documents that I have already assembled for you." Mrs. Farnsworth was oddly fascinating, Kate thought. Her figure was petite, sprite-like, almost like a child's figure, but it was her face underneath a wealth of brown hair that captured and held the viewer's attention. Her luminous eyes were brown with large dark irises. Her lips were full and sensual. Her mercurial mouth seemed capable of almost any expression, and with every change of expression her face seemed completely remade. Unlike her guests, most of whom were conventionally garbed, her costume was dramatic. An emerald green robe with a low-cut gauze-sleeved green bodice decorated with blue-green feathers and exotic markings. She wore a gold pendant at her throat, which, Kate saw in an instant of startled recognition, was similar to her aunt's. Mrs. Farnsworth's theatrical dress was no doubt explained by the fact that she was a retired actress. Quite recently retired, it seemed, from the collection of colourful playbills Kate had remarked in the hallway. Two of George Bernard Shaw's were prominently featured: Widowers' Houses and Arms and the Man, as well as Shakespeare's As You Like It, which had apparently enjoyed a long run at the St. James. Mrs. Farnsworth had recently changed her name, it seemed. On the playbill she appeared as Florence Farber. Kate couldn't help but think that she must have made a fetching Rosalind. Like the lady, Mrs. Farnsworth's parlour was dramatically decorated. The plum-coloured walls were hung with Oriental-style draperies and ivory fans. Sculptures of Egyptian deities stood on painted columns in the corners, and hieroglyphic paintings, copied in the British Museum, Aunt Sabrina confided in a whisper, by Mrs. Farnsworth herself, occupied prominent places in the dimly lighted room. The oriental carpets that overspread the floor were rich of blues and purples, although they were worn, as were the furnishings. It was a room of someone who had a more exotic taste than ready money for them. But the room was quite small, and its decor was hardly visible in the crush of people. Aunt Sabrina made her way through the crowd, murmuring greetings here and there, Kate just a step behind. They paused on the outskirts of the group gathering in front of the fireplace. Dominating the group was Oscar Wilde, a tall man several inches over 6 feet and portly. His dark brown hair fell nearly to his shoulders, and his lips were full and finely chiseled in a face that spoke of dissipation. He was elegantly dressed in a lavender-tailed coat, flowered waistcoat, and white silk cravat loosely tied. Listening, Kate thought that his sentences, although they were clearly extemporaneous, seemed perfectly composed, that he had constructed them in writing and delivered them from memory. The conversation was not about some mystical topic, but on the subject of America. "Of course," Mr. Wilde said, drawling the words with wry humour, "if one had enough money to go to America, one would not go." With languid grace he tapped his cigarette into the fireplace behind him. "I fear you are right," Wilde said, the tweedy, heavy-set gentleman beside him. He adjusted his polka-dot tie with one massive, deranged hand. "I will be launching an American tour in a few days, but I must say I am still smarting over what happened with my study in Scarlet, virtually purloined by Lippincott." Kate looked at the man, surprised. He must be Conan Doyle. How odd. In her imagination, the author had resembled his character, lean and gaunt, with the piercing eyes and a hawk-like beak of a nose. But Mr. Doyle was clearly fond of his table. He was stout and hearty, with thick hands and the wide flat nose of a boxer. He had the appearance of a man who had never read a book in his life and had not noticed the absence. "Yes," Wilde said lazily, leaning on one elbow against the green marble mantel and pulling at his jowl with his fingers. "Until quite recently, American publishers took what they liked without the annoyance of parting with their money." He rolled his eyes dramatically. "Americans, always in hot pursuit of the next moment, as if they were catching a train. It is a state of affairs not favorable to poetry." "Perhaps," Kate said quietly, "Americans do not require poetry to accompany their affairs." All eyes shifted to her. The corner of Doyle's mouth quirked. Another man, intense and dark-haired, with fine-cut intellectual features on the heavy brows, smothered a laugh and ended by breaking into a violent cough that shook his double pince-nez from his nose. Wilde cocked one eyebrow, scantily amused. "Quite good, quite good, my dear lady," he drawled. He paused, letting the silence lengthen while Kate felt her cheeks redden. "An American, I presume?" He turned to the dark-haired young man. "One can always distinguish American women by their exquisitely incoherent speech, Willie. Like exploding crackers. One is reminded of Sheridan in The Rivals. They are as headstrong as an allegory on the banks of the Nile." The young man with the pince-nez spoke up. "I hardly think the lady's remark was incoherent, Oscar. In fact, I rather imagine she bested you." His voice held more than a tint of Irish. His soft grey tie was inexpertly and crookedly tied, and he wore a small cluster of feathers in his lapel. Kate's eye widened slightly when she saw them. Blue feathers, bright blue, iridescent blue. And she realized that they were very alike the feather that she had found this very morning. The young man smiled at Kate. "Well done, Miss—" "A gentleman," Aunt Sabrina said. "May I present my niece, Miss Catherine Ardley, Mr. Weil, Mr. Doyle, and Mr. Yeats. As you have guessed, gentlemen, Miss Ardley is an American by birth." "But Irish by nature, I perceive, as well as by name and appearance," Wilde interrupted elegantly. He took Kate's hand and bowed over it with an extravagant flourish. "My friend Willie Yeats is quite right, Miss Ardley. You have bested me, but I confess it willingly, for besting Oscar Wilde is allowed only to that exquisite divinity who boggles him with her beauty." "Then I fear you are easily boggled, Mr. Wilde," Kate said, retrieving her hand, her eyes fastened on Willie Yeats' blue feathers, "and therefore easily bested." Wilde's eyebrows went up. Yeats chuckled dryly, and Kate realized that he must be the man for whom she was copying the cipher transcript. She would somehow have to pursue the matter of Yeats' feathers. But she was momentarily sidetracked by Conan Doyle's remark about a study in scarlet. "Is it true about the copyright of your work, Mr. Doyle?" she asked, turning to him. "It was stolen?" "Yes," Doyle allowed, "it was. Though to be fair, the theft was rather made up by what Lippincott paid me to write the sign of 4. He coughed. Don't know that the offer would have been quite so handsome if American readers hadn't already gotten on to Scarlet." "You certainly have many American readers," Kate said, thinking to turn the conversation toward the question she wanted to ask. "They have banded into Let's Keep Holmes Alive clubs to protest the unfortunate demise of your most famous detective." Doyle's thrust his hand into his pocket. "Chap's dead," he said. "Let him rest." But why?" Kate persisted. "If one of my characters were to win such a fervent following, I do not believe I would dare to—" Doyle's half-smile was somewhat patronizing. "My dear young lady, I doubt you can understand the situation not being an author. But Kate checked herself on the brink of betraying Beryl Bardwell. "Perhaps you're right." "The truth is that I am no longer interested in detective stories," Doyle remarked with a self-important air. "My aim is to write serious book. Micah Clarke is one such effort. Have you read it?" "I must confess I have not," Kate said. "An admirable work, my dear Doyle," Wilde put in lazily, "if somewhat wearying. Still, one rather doesn't enjoy robust adventure when someone else does the adventuring." "Holmes gets in the way of my other writing, you see," Doyle said to Kate, ignoring Wilde completely. "And my psychic research, which is most interesting to me," he looked around, "which, of course, is why I'm here." "Ghost haunting," Yeats said with some scorn. "My dear man," Doyle replied, raising his chin, "that is not an attribute one replies to the Society for Psychical Research." Kate regarded him with interest. "But why can you not write both serious literature and detective stories? Surely the two are not exclusive." Doyle spoke as if he was speaking to a child. "My dear young lady, you clearly do not understand the labors of authorship. The difficulty is that each short story needs as clear-cut and original a plot as a longish book would do." He frowned. "At any rate, Holmes is dead. Even if I wanted to bring the fellow back to life, I could not. He lies at the bottom of a vast precipice." "But Sherlock Holmes can hardly remain dead," Kate objected pertly. "Your readers will not allow it, and I think it would not be difficult to call him from the vasty deep, sir." Wyatt's full lips curved slightly upwards. But will he come when you call for him? That, dear Doyle, is the question." "He will come," Kate said, "if you can call in the right way. He should reappear in some interesting disguise, I think, so that the manner of his reappearance distracts the attention from the fact of it. He should then explain to Dr. Watson that he sent Professor Moriarty into the dreadful chasm in his stead, perhaps with some sleight of hand, such as Baritsu." "Baritsu?" Doyle asked doubtfully. "A form of Japanese wrestling," Kate said. Mr. Yeats smiled. "The lady is ingenious, Doyle." Doyle pulled his brow together. "You're forgetting the tracks," he said. "In the final problem, Dr. Watson observed that 2 persons went down the path, and none returned." Kate raised her brows. I imagine that a man of Mr. Holmes' resourcefulness could scale a cliff or two. I also imagine that he might go into hiding to escape the Professor's confederates, while entrusting to his brother Mycroft the maintenance of his Baker Street lodgings. That would explain his absence from London and his failure to communicate with Dr. Watson. Wilde's puffy-lidded eyes were amused. As Holmes would say, my dear Doyle, the impression of a woman may be more valuable than the conclusion of an analytical reasoner. He pursed his lips. There you have it, dear sir. The plot trotted out in toto. Or is it en tutu? Ignoring Willie Yeats's groan, he added, What do you say, Doyle, to Mrs. Ardley's spirited resurrection of Sherlock Holmes? Doyle shook his head, stubbornly beetle-browed. Fellow's dead, and dead he stays. I shan't have him bullying me for the rest of my days. Wilde leaned toward Kate and lowered his voice confidentially. I perceive, Miss Ardley, that we have hit upon our friend's sore spot. Like Frankenstein, he has created in Holmes a being with eternal life. Like Frankenstein, he cannot be rid of the monster. Such a fate is truly something to fear. I don't see what you're getting at, Doyle said. He looked around, scowling. When's the séance? Ah, yes, he turned to Mrs. Farnsworth, who had just come up to them. I told him there was bound to be table rapping, Florence. When do we begin? I am sorry, gentlemen, Mrs. Farnsworth said, but there is to be no séance this afternoon. No séance, Doyle protested. Mrs. Farnsworth smiled. If I had known if that's what you wanted, Mr. Doyle, we could have arranged something. Her smile became playful. But spirits certainly abound here. They may communicate with you if you make your willingness known. Do be on the lookout. Oh, I shall, Doyle said with enormous seriousness. I shall indeed. No spirit shall get by me. Kate was suddenly seized with the urge to laugh.